let's talk about the rules of Redux and like the sort of some best practices and where, where certain code goes, what code should go where in this. So you kind of know the basic things that make up a Redux app now. So you've got connected components or containers, which is just a basic React component which is connected to the store, and then it just receives the store via props. So that's one thing. You've got kind of your action files, which normally don't do like that much in what we've seen, something like this, but they'll just, they're the actions that are going to happen. And then you've got the reducers, which convert an action in the previous state into the new state for that part of the store that the reducer is responsible for. So what kind of, like, when I say rules, and basically it's like kind of rules of thumb. So the first thing is, if you want, so you've got your state in your store and you've connected to it, and that's all cool. If you want something to happen and for something to change on the screen, and you're using Redux, so someone clicks a button and something happens, that's an action. And you fire actions by dispatching them from components. Let's have a look at one of those here, like this, like when we're updating the text. If you want to change anything on the screen, pretty much always going to dispatch something, because in order for the screen to change, you need to dispatch something so the store can change, so that the connected components can show that change. So if you want something to change, or if the user, on click, someone typing in a box, all that sort of thing, you're going to dispatch an action. So that's like kind of the first thing, and that dispatch will usually go inside of a container, which is why this is why I've passed lambdas down. So I didn't really talk about this too much earlier on, but here you can see I've created all these props where I'm passing a lambda in, and then the to-do list component, when that thing happens, it just calls the prop, so we come back up here. That's because what my containers, I think if you're doing this is subjective, but in my opinion, if you're doing this well, I think you'll have containers like this which look pretty boring, which are really responsible for connecting and for getting callbacks and dispatching things. And you should probably keep these container things pretty small, other than really passing down the relevant props, connecting, and then when things happen, dispatching things. I think in general, you can obviously do other stuff in here. We could have written, this to-do list thing does about, it has all of this in it. We could have just put that in here. And it is a little bit arbitrary, and it's really just about where you want things. But then what that means is you have a nice to-do list component that in theory, potentially you could reuse. So that's probably a good idea to keep your containers just to do like these three things: dispatching, deciding which parts of state to connect to and connecting, and passing the props from that connection down into subcomponents that you're rendering. Quite often you might dispatch things on component will mount. That's quite common. Let's say you want to go load some data from an API, probably going to go in here. So you'll be like this.props.dispatch. I don't know, like load to-dos or something. That might be something you decide to do. That's pretty common for us. So once you dispatch actions, what code goes in actions? So say, for example, we're going to cover loading data asynchronously shortly. Say, for example, you want to load some data from a HTTP API or somewhere external to your application. Where does that code go? So the convention seems to be, from looking at other people's code around the internet, that kind of code goes in actions. So at the moment you don't know how to do that, but if you've got some sort of data you want to go and grab, or you want to do something before you really get into the reducer, then it has to go in the actions. It's almost because there's nowhere else left to go. I mean, you could put it in your component, you could technically put it in the reducer, but remember, reducers are pure functional, they're pure functions. So you can't modify state. And another thing that a pure function means that I didn't talk about earlier on is that you can't make asynchronous calls. You can't change the state of the world. So if you run a function twice in a row, it should always return the same thing. If you run it 1,000 times with the same inputs, it will always return you the same thing. But if you go off and you make a network request or something, then it might do a different thing to the last time, so that's bad. So you can't make network calls like go and get data from other sources like HTTP APIs. You can't do that inside reducers. So really the only logical place is the action or the component. It kind of gets messy if you put it inside your component, because I really like components to just be like, here's some props, render some stuff, or connect and dispatch. But it's kind of messy if you're like, oh, make this HTTP request and then dispatch the things that come back. You could do it, but I think probably it's a good idea to stick that code in actions, and I'll show you how in the Redux Thunk video that's coming up. So that's kind of what it goes in there. Reducers are just, like I said, always pretty, like, they're just like state, action, what's the new state. So they never really do much else, to be honest. They all look quite similar in the long run. There's one more place that you might want to put code, and that's selectors, but I'll go through that in a separate video. But those are kind of the rules. So you can, if someone does something, you're going to fire an action, which is going to come to one or more reducers, and it will get fired to all the reducers, and some of those reducers will actually look for that action and do something, and they'll change their part of the store. So you can fire actions, and you can connect to the props. Probably in most programs that you write. So if you're a beginner and you're just starting out with this, probably try using Redux for 100% of stuff. If you're pro beans and you're feeling really good about it, sometimes I still use state. Sometimes, but it's pretty rare for me. It kind of depends. Sometimes it's useful. An example that came up recently was I had a slider where you could slide there's like a little thing and you can slide it along, and by default, the way that I'd coded it, it was firing Redux actions every notch when you were dragging the slider along. Because a lot of components like that, there's like a feedback loop. You fire the action, you dispatch the action, and then the props are, you get the connection back. When you've connected in your container, you get the data back from the Redux store. But a lot of components in React won't work properly unless you've linked them back to the store. So for example, when you're sliding that slider along, say it's got a value between 1 and 10 and you slide it to 2, from 1 to 2, if you've not connected the value of that slider to the Redux store so that it now says 2, you'll slide it, the action will fire, say, or if you don't have an action, nothing will happen, and then the little slider won't move because the value needs to change to 2 for the slider to move. There's a lot of things like that. So you end up connecting a lot of things. And sometimes one disadvantage of that is that if you want to write some code and use it across multiple projects or build a library that other people can use, in some ways using state is more convenient because it's very self-contained. Someone else can grab that and it will just work. So there are times that state is useful because you just don't, there's not a lot of benefit to having that thing in Redux state, but I think, like, especially if you're starting out, or if you've got a choice between should I put it in Redux state or shouldn't I, err on the side of putting it in, because most of the time that's the right thing to do, and ideally your whole state of your application will land up in there. And so if at any point in time you look in the Redux state, you'll see everything. So that's also a golden rule. The next rule of doing this, and this is again subjective, but I strongly believe in it, is when you're storing what's in your state, you should keep it dry. So DRY, don't repeat yourself. For those of you that have been programming for a long time, I'm sure you'll know what that really means. But just for those of you that don't, it means you shouldn't really store like the same thing twice in your code. It's a concept which applies to a lot of things. It applies to data, and it kind of applies to code as well. But for example, with the to-dos, I'll probably give you an example in a later video of a way that you can dry it. But in general, if, say for example, you were going to store the to-dos and you were going to filter them, you could have like the currently filtered to-dos and all the to-dos in Redux state. But currently filtered to-dos, it will include some of the to-dos. So you've got like duplicated data. So you've got all the to-dos and then a subset of them. So, if that subset has 3 of them and there are 6 to-dos, then those 3 you've got twice in your Redux store. In general, over time, I've avoided any kind of duplication like that. So you kind of, before you sit down to code, you want to think in your head, maybe you get a pen and paper and sketch it out, or put it, in an empty Sublime window or something. What's the minimum set of state that I can have in my store that represents the problem? So probably in that example, the filter one, it will be a filter term which you put in the box. So maybe you put hello in the box, and it's all of the to-dos. And then from that, you can calculate what are the to-dos that should be shown. Now, one place you can calculate that is in your components. So your component will be connected, and it will know the filter term's hello, and you've got these 6 to-dos. And then you can run the logic to say, okay, given the fact that they've put hello in the box, you can do like a filter and say, actually, only these 3 to-dos are relevant, and then you can do that in your component. There's another place you can do it which is better, and that's called a selector, which we'll talk about in a future video. And selectors are very important when coupled with this idea. And selectors are something which I think people aren't using enough with Redux, partially because although the creator of Redux has done a lot of great work and he's built this excellent framework, I think it's not super accessible, and the selectors, reselectors, the library, which really explains the concept. I read it like 2 or 3 times because I kind of knew I wanted to use it, and I was like, I just didn't really get it fully the first couple of times, and eventually I kind of got it. And so now we use it all the time, and actually a lot of our app logic, I think selectors are incredibly important, and they're often underused with people that are new to Redux. So it's quite an important thing for us to cover. So yeah, so in general, store the minimum amount of crap that you can in your store. Don't put extra, don't duplicate things. Don't put things in there you don't need. It should sort of be minimum set of stuff. So quite common if, you've got like a list of things and you're editing one, you should just store the index of the one or the ID of the one you're editing, because then you can be like, well, I've got 6 to-dos and I know I'm editing number 4, say, if this app had an edit functionality, then you can figure out what to-do that is, right? You take the to-dos and you take the number 4 and you index the array by 4, and you can say, oh, it's this one, right? So you don't need to store the whole to-do again. So that's a good rule of thumb for this stuff. And that's kind of it, really. Fire actions. Any code to like go to a server and do stuff probably lives in the action when you're going to use Redux Thunk, which I'll show you in a later video. Keep the minimal amount of stuff you can in state, and in your connected components, really just think about connecting, dispatching, and grabbing the props. Using those props and passing them down to just normal React components that don't really know anything about Redux. That also makes your code more testable if you're doing testing.